Hello, listeners. Welcome back to TubTube podcast community. In today's episode, let's know about the Great Fire of London, which began on September 2nd, 1666, was one of the most devastating events in the city's history. Starting in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, the fire spread rapidly due to the city's dense timber structures and strong winds, eventually destroying 4/5 of the city, including iconic landmarks like St. Paul's Cathedral. Despite the enormous material losses, with an estimated £10 million in damage, the fire led to crucial rebuilding efforts, transforming London's architecture and fire safety regulations, ultimately shaping the modern city we know today. Chapter 1. A Spark in the Dark. On the night of September 2nd, 1666, few could have imagined that a tiny spark in a bakery on Pudding Lane would ignite one of the most devastating fires in British history. The story of the Great Fire of London begins in the bustling heart of the city, where the dense, timber-framed houses and narrow alleyways made it a perfect environment for a deadly blaze. The fire started in the bakery of Thomas Farriner, located on Pudding Lane. Farriner had been a baker for many years, and his oven was known to be reliable, but that night, something went terribly wrong. Farriner, having just closed the shop for the night, left his oven still burning to keep the bread warm for the morning. In the early hours of September 2nd, a small spark ignited the timber structure of the bakery. It's believed that the fire could have started from one of the embers in the oven catching onto the surrounding timber, or from a spark that fell from the chimney. The bakery, like most buildings in London at the time, was constructed from timber, a material that, though readily available, was extremely flammable. The buildings were packed tightly together, and the small wooden houses had thatched roofs, making the city an ideal tinderbox for a disaster. As the first flames began to lick the sides of the bakery, Farriner and his family were inside, but none of them immediately realized the danger. Farriner's maid was the first to notice the smoke. By the time Farriner himself noticed, it was already too late. The fire spread quickly through the structure. In a desperate attempt to save themselves, Farriner and his family fled the building, but not before some of the fire spread to neighboring houses. The flames quickly consumed nearby buildings, and soon the fire was beyond control. Farriner's Bakery, a small establishment by modern standards, became the catalyst for one of the largest and most destructive fires in the history of London. The timing of the fire could not have been worse. London had endured a dry summer with little rainfall, leaving the city's wooden structures dry and brittle. The buildings were tightly packed, with no space between them to slow the fire's progress. A strong east wind that night drove the flames through the city, propelling them from building to building, making it nearly impossible to contain the fire in its early stages. The first hours of the fire were spent trying to save the neighboring buildings, but the fire had already spread too far. The early attempts to combat the flames were largely ineffective. The only tools available to the citizens of London were small buckets of water, and the fire brigades at the time were poorly equipped and largely uncoordinated. The mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was alerted to the fire, but his response was slow and indecisive. In fact, it is said that when Bloodworth was first informed of the fire, he dismissed it as a minor concern, believing that the fire would burn itself out. By the time any serious attempts at firefighting were made, the fire had already begun to rage out of control. The citizens of London watched in horror as the flames spread rapidly, leaping from house to house, with no way to stop them. The fire had begun to eat its way through the heart of London, and its spread seemed unstoppable. The lack of effective firefighting methods and the disorganized response left the city vulnerable, and the fire was already beyond the control of those who were trying to contain it. Chapter 2. The Fire Spreads. As dawn broke on the morning of September 3rd, 1666, the city of London was already facing a crisis. What had started as a small fire in a bakery had now become a massive conflagration, sweeping through the heart of the city with terrifying speed. The fire spread rapidly, fueled by the dry summer weather, the wooden construction of the buildings, and the strong winds that whipped through the narrow streets. The fire spread from Pudding Lane to the surrounding areas of Cheapside, Candlewick Street, and Lombard Street, key trading districts in London. The densely packed buildings, with their wooden frames and thatched roofs, were the perfect kindling for the flames. Whole blocks of houses were consumed by the fire, and as the flames moved further westward, they reached important areas of the city, including the Royal Exchange and St. Paul's Cathedral. Despite early attempts to stop the fire, it continued to gain strength, and the situation became increasingly dire. The citizens of London were terrified, and many began to flee the city, carrying their belongings with them. The lack of proper firefighting equipment meant that the fire could not be contained. The primitive firefighting methods employed by the people of London, such as throwing water from buckets and creating fire breaks by demolishing buildings, were insufficient to combat the scale of the disaster. By midday on September 3rd, it became clear that the fire was beyond control. The fire spread relentlessly, and large sections of the city were engulfed in flames. Key buildings, including shops, homes, and landmarks, were destroyed. It wasn't just the buildings that were at risk, lives were also in danger. Thousands of people had to evacuate their homes, leaving their belongings behind as the fire consumed everything in its path. In response to the worsening situation, the authorities attempted to take more drastic action. Fire breaks, strategically demolishing buildings to prevent the fire from spreading, were created, but these efforts were largely ineffective. The fire continued to spread at an alarming rate, leaping over streets, jumping from one building to the next, and overwhelming the citizens who were trying desperately to contain it. It became evident that nothing could stop the fire from reaching the heart of London. As the fire moved further into the city, it also began to affect some of London's most important landmarks. On September 4th, the fire reached St. Paul's Cathedral, which was undergoing renovations at the time. The great church, designed by Christopher Wren, was a symbol of London's power and grandeur. But as the flames reached the cathedral, the roof caught fire. The wooden scaffolding used in the renovation caught alight, and soon the entire roof of the cathedral was engulfed in flames. Within hours, the roof collapsed, and much of the structure was severely damaged. The loss of St. Paul's Cathedral was a devastating blow for the city. It was not just a loss of an important building, but also a symbol of London's cultural and religious identity. The destruction of St. Paul's was a turning point in the fire, marking the point at which it became clear that the city would face immense losses. By September 5th, the fire had burned for nearly 4 days, with no sign of slowing down. The flames had spread throughout central London, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to ashes. The fire seemed unstoppable, and the city was on the brink of collapse. The people of London watched in horror as their city was consumed by the flames, and the death toll, though not immediately clear, was rising. The fire had wiped out one of the world's greatest cities, and it seemed as if nothing could save it from total destruction. Chapter 3: The Battle to Contain the Flames. As the fire tore through London during its first few days, it became evident that the city was not equipped to deal with such a catastrophic event. The authorities and citizens alike were overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster. What was originally perceived as a manageable fire turned into an inferno, spreading rapidly and with devastating efficiency, consuming the city block by block. By the morning of September 4th, London was already facing a full-scale crisis. A disorganized response. The attempt to control the fire on September 3rd was disorganized and hampered by several factors. First, the firefighting equipment available at the time was rudimentary at best. London's firefighting infrastructure was entirely based on volunteer efforts and limited resources. People relied on bucket brigades, where citizens would form lines to pass water from hand to hand. But this method was not nearly sufficient to contain the enormous flames. There was no professional fire department, no fire trucks, and no organized plans to combat such a large-scale disaster. Furthermore, London's medieval street layout contributed to the fire's spread. The narrow, winding lanes left no room for large-scale firefighting equipment to pass, and the buildings were often situated right next to one another, with only a small gap between structures. The construction of these buildings, mostly timber and thatch, meant that once a fire ignited, it could jump from one house to another in seconds. Another issue was the lack of a clear chain of command during the early days of the fire. The mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was one of the first officials to respond to the disaster, but his approach was hesitant and ineffective. When he was alerted to the fire on September 2nd, he dismissed it as a minor problem. It wasn't until hours later that he ordered some measures to combat the flames, but by that point, the fire was already well beyond his control. As the fire spread through London, it soon became clear that Bloodworth's lack of decisive leadership was a major hindrance. The creation of fire breaks. The authorities tried to take more drastic action on September 3rd, hoping to prevent the fire from spreading further. One strategy was the creation of fire breaks. Fire breaks were areas where buildings were intentionally demolished to create a gap between the fire and other structures. The idea was that these gaps would stop the fire from jumping from one side of a street to the other. However, these efforts were largely ineffective due to the sheer intensity of the flames. Even as buildings were torn down in an effort to slow the fire, the flames simply jumped over the gaps, continuing their relentless march through the city. The efforts to create fire breaks seemed futile in the face of the fire's unstoppable advance. Moreover, the fire breaks that were created often led to significant property damage. Some wealthy individuals were able to save their homes by having their properties demolished, but for the vast majority of the city's residents, the creation of fire breaks offered little in the way of salvation. The poor, who lived in the most densely packed areas of London, had nowhere to go, and their homes were the first to fall victim to the flames. The role of the Navy. As the fire spread further, the authorities began to call in other resources in an attempt to stop the destruction. The Navy, under the leadership of Admiral Sir Robert Holmes, was summoned to assist with firefighting efforts. The Navy was tasked with helping to create fire breaks by using controlled demolitions and by attempting to bring in more water to fight the fire. However, these efforts were still not enough to halt the inferno. The Navy had some success in demolishing structures to create larger fire breaks, but this effort was slowed by the chaos in the streets and the overwhelming number of buildings that were already engulfed in flames. The lack of organization among the various groups trying to combat the fire meant that their efforts were fragmented and ineffective. Wind and weather. Nature's unrelenting ally to the flames. One of the most significant factors that fueled the Great Fire of London was the strong winds that swept through the city in the early days of September. The winds, which were particularly strong on September 2nd and 3rd, blew directly into the heart of the city, fanning the flames and helping them spread quickly from building to building. The wind turned the fire into an uncontrollable monster, propelling it far beyond what the city's inhabitants could have imagined. Additionally, the dry weather leading up to the fire meant that the timber buildings of London were already dry and brittle, which made them more susceptible to the flames. The summer of 1666 had been particularly dry, and there had been little rainfall in the months leading up to the fire. This created the perfect conditions for a devastating blaze. The fire could not be contained simply by fighting it from the ground. The winds carried embers over rooftops, starting new fires far away from the original blaze. The fire spread so quickly that even the brave citizens who were trying to fight it couldn't keep up. As the flames moved quickly across the city, they consumed large swathes of central London, including major areas like Cheapside, Lombard Street, and Fleet Street. St. Paul's Cathedral, a monument to loss. As the fire spread through London, one of the most iconic and emotional moments of the disaster came when the flames reached St. Paul's Cathedral, which was still under construction. The cathedral, designed by renowned architect Christopher Wren, was a symbol of London's power and religious devotion. It had been the center of the Church of England in the city for centuries, and its destruction was a blow to the heart of the city. The fire reached the cathedral on September 4th, and by that afternoon, the flames had spread to the scaffolding surrounding the building. The roof of the cathedral was made of wood, and the flames quickly consumed it. The fire eventually collapsed the roof, and much of the building was severely damaged. The destruction of St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the most iconic landmarks of the time, was a symbol of the fire's unchecked power. For Londoners, the fall of St. Paul's was a devastating moment. The cathedral was not just a place of worship, but also a symbol of London's strength and resilience. Its destruction marked the moment when it became clear that the fire had already taken on the scale of a national disaster. It was not just the homes of the people that were at risk, it was the heart of the city itself. Chapter 4. A City in Ruins. By the end of September 5th, 1666, when the fire was finally beginning to die down, London had suffered an immense loss. The fire had burned for 4 days, destroying vast swathes of the city. The extent of the damage was incomprehensible, and the scale of the destruction was so overwhelming that it left London a mere shell of its former self. Property losses. The scale of the destruction was staggering. Nearly 70,000 people were left homeless. The total material losses from the fire are estimated to be around £10 million. Given the scale of the destruction, about 436 acres of the city, or roughly a quarter of the city, and destroyed 13,200 houses, 87 churches including the iconic St. Paul's Cathedral, had been burned to the ground, and important public buildings. This sum reflects the value of all the lost buildings, structures, goods, and businesses. For comparison, £10 million in 1666 would be equivalent to an astronomical amount in today's money. Using historical inflation calculators, some estimates place this sum in the range of £1.6 billion to £2 billion in today's terms, making it one of the most costly disasters in London's history. In terms of landmarks, the Royal Exchange, a vital center of commerce, was reduced to ashes. The city's infrastructure, roads, bridges, and buildings, had been obliterated, leaving an apocalyptic scene where only charred remains of once proud structures remained. The fire had also consumed records, legal documents, and financial paperwork, leaving many traders and business owners unable to reclaim their lost goods. The destruction of St. Paul's Cathedral was one of the most symbolic losses for the city. Christopher Wren's architectural masterpiece, which had yet to be completed, was reduced to a smoldering shell. This loss hit the people of London deeply, as the cathedral was not only a place of religious significance, but also a symbol of the city's cultural and spiritual strength. The devastation of such an iconic landmark only intensified the feeling that London's soul had been scorched. Loss of life and human toll. While the material destruction was staggering, the loss of life was, surprisingly, relatively low. Estimates place the death toll at around 6, although it is possible that the true number was higher but unrecorded due to the chaos and rapid evacuation. However, the number of people who were affected by the fire, those who lost homes, businesses, and livelihoods, was far greater. Most of the displaced sought refuge in the fields outside the city or in temporary shelters set up in nearby villages. Many of the poor, who lived in the heart of the city and in the most vulnerable districts, were particularly hard hit. They often had no means to rebuild or recover what they had lost. The wealthy and well-off, on the other hand, had some means to escape the fire and rebuild their estates, but even they suffered devastating losses. The fire wiped out valuable commodities and financial assets, leading to an economic collapse for some sections of society. The survivors were forced to rebuild their lives from the ashes. Many people who had lived in the city for generations were now faced with the reality of starting over. Yet, in the face of this tragedy, there was also an extraordinary resilience. The determination of Londoners to rise from the ruins would shape the city's future, even if that future would take years to realize. The emotional and psychological impact. The emotional toll of the Great Fire of London was profound. For the people who had witnessed the destruction of their homes, businesses, and places of worship, the trauma would last long after the flames had been extinguished. The loss of St. Paul's Cathedral was particularly symbolic, as it represented not just the loss of a physical building, but also a cultural and spiritual blow to the city. The fire had destroyed not only buildings, but also a sense of security and permanence that had existed for centuries. For many, the sense of fear and helplessness lingered long after the fire was out. Citizens had watched helplessly as their city burned, unable to prevent the catastrophe. The fire had felt unstoppable, and even after the flames had been contained, there was an overwhelming sense that London had been laid bare. The city's identity had been shattered, and its people were forced to grapple with the enormity of the loss. The psychological trauma was not limited to those who had lived through the fire. The news of the Great Fire spread throughout England, and people across the country were struck by the tragedy. It was a moment that gripped the entire nation, and for many, it was a stark reminder of the fragility of life. Chapter 5. The Aftermath and the Rebuilding Effort. A New London Rising. By September 6, 1666, after 4 days of relentless flames, the Great Fire of London had finally run its course. London, a city that had once thrived as one of Europe's major financial and cultural hubs, was left in ruins. The devastation was incomprehensible, and the impact of the disaster reached deep into every aspect of life in the city. What emerged in the aftermath was a broken city, struggling to come to terms with the loss, but also one filled with hope for the future, a city that would need to rebuild not only its physical structures, but also its identity. As the smoke cleared from the ruins of London, the citizens and leaders of the city were faced with the daunting task of rebuilding. However, from the depths of despair came a glimmer of hope. London's resilience would become evident in the weeks and months that followed. The fire, though devastating, provided an opportunity to rebuild the city in a more modern, organized, and fire-resistant way. Immediate responses. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, the priority was to provide shelter and basic provisions for the homeless. Temporary shelters were set up outside the city, and many of the displaced sought refuge with relatives or in the countryside. Relief efforts were organized, though they were slow and chaotic in the first days following the fire. The government offered emergency funds to those who had lost their homes, and various aid packages were distributed, but the scale of the damage meant that these efforts were only a drop in the ocean compared to the immense needs of the population. One immediate consequence of the disaster was the mass displacement of London's population. Approximately 1/4 of the city's population was left without a permanent home. This created temporary housing challenges that would last for years, especially as many people returned to the city to rebuild, facing the harsh realities of having no place to live in the meantime. The cost of rebuilding London. The official reconstruction funds. Following the fire, the British government and the Crown sought ways to raise funds to help rebuild the city. King Charles II initially ordered the collection of contributions from wealthier Londoners, along with a form of taxation. He granted some financial relief to property owners, though it would take time to recoup from such extensive damage. The role of private investment. Much of the money required to rebuild London came from private investments, particularly from the wealthier merchants and landowners. The Insurance Act passed in 1667 allowed for a form of fire insurance to help property owners who lost their assets in the fire. However, because the scale of the fire was so enormous, these insurance schemes did not cover the full extent of the rebuilding costs. Christopher Wren's design and costs. Christopher Wren, appointed to oversee the rebuilding of St. Paul's Cathedral and other major public buildings, was given a significant budget for his work, though it was insufficient to complete all his original plans. The total cost of rebuilding St. Paul's Cathedral alone was around £1.5 million in 17th century currency, which would be roughly equivalent to £300 million to £500 million today. The cost of rebuilding infrastructure. Aside from rebuilding individual homes and churches, the city's infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and marketplaces, also had to be completely overhauled. The cost of rebuilding these systems and expanding them to accommodate the growing population of London was substantial. Estimates suggest that over £5 million were needed for the rebuilding effort, considering not only the cost of constructing new buildings, but also laying new sewer systems, widening streets, and implementing fire breaks and other fire prevention measures. For perspective, £5 million in the 17th century would be equivalent to about £1 billion today. Time taken to rebuild. Rebuilding London did not happen overnight. The physical reconstruction of the city and its infrastructure took several decades, with major rebuilding efforts extending well into the 1680s. The Great Fire Act of 1667 allowed for new regulations concerning building materials, construction methods, and urban planning, all of which contributed to the reconstruction process. Effect on national finances. While London was the main focus of the rebuilding efforts, the financial cost of the fire did not only impact the city. The Crown had to allocate considerable funds to assist with rebuilding and recovery, which in turn affected the national economy. This was especially significant in an era where the English monarchy was heavily reliant on taxing the City of London and its residents to fund royal projects and maintain control over the empire. The loss of business and commerce also affected government revenue from taxes, as merchants and traders found it difficult to pay their dues in the wake of such a catastrophic event. Rebuilding the economy. In the long term, the fire had a massive economic impact. While rebuilding the physical infrastructure of the city took many years, London's commercial and financial systems slowly began to recover. The fire did lead to some improvements in fire prevention, e.g., the prohibition of timber-framed buildings in certain parts of the city, and the city's financial sector bounced back over time. The destruction of older, cramped housing and buildings allowed for new constructions that were more resilient and better suited to the demands of a growing city. The use of stone and brick for new buildings replaced the timber structures that had contributed to the fire's rapid spread. Some of London's most iconic architectural feats, like Rennes' St. Paul's Cathedral, would eventually rise from the ashes, standing as a symbol of the city's resilience and recovery. However, despite these improvements, it took London several decades to fully recover from the fire's economic and social consequences. Trade and commerce, though revived, would never return to pre-fire levels immediately. The Great Fire became a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of planning, innovation, and collaboration in the face of catastrophe. Chapter 6. A City Transformed, the New London. Over the next several years, London began to recover from the ashes of the Great Fire. Though the physical scars of the disaster remained for years, the fire marked the beginning of a transformation for the city. The rebuilding process, though slow, provided an opportunity to modernize London's infrastructure and to rethink the urban environment in a way that would prepare it for the future. By the end of the 17th century, London had reinvented itself. Rennes' grand designs were just the beginning. The city's recovery was marked not only by physical reconstruction, but also by new systems of governance and a renewed sense of identity. The people of London had learned from the tragedy and many of the lessons from the fire, such as fire safety regulations and improved urban planning, would influence future generations. The Great Fire of London, while an undeniable tragedy, became a catalyst for the city's rebirth, symbolizing resilience, innovation, and a spirit of recovery that would define London for centuries to come. Thanks for listening to this podcast. New episodes are released every Monday through Friday, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to never miss out. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like, share, and leave a review. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.